And for more, we're joined now by Richard Goldberg, Senior Advisor for the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, speaking to us from Chicago, Illinois. And Richard, great to have you back. So let me ask you, in the earlier part of negotiations, we heard sort of optimistic statements coming from Iranian officials. Now it looks like Iran is putting it on hold. There's reports of some difficulties. And of course, we have this Ebrahim Raisi, someone considered, I'm talking about in the context of Iranian politics, even more hardline than Hassan Rouhani. So do you see the chances of reaching a deal acceptable to Iran is sort of dimming along the way here?
Well, I think, first of all, thanks for having me, but I think that Iran is frankly surprised of how much they're able to get away with without having to go back into the nuclear deal. The Biden administration, remember, started by saying that they wanted to go back into the deal to try to negotiate a longer, stronger deal after that covered missiles and terrorism and other things, and that the maximum pressure campaign would stay until Iran agreed to come back into compliance with the deal. But what we've seen is that on a number of fronts, Iran is able to use its malign activities without merely any response from the United States. Whether we see attacks in Iraq, the relieving of pressure on the Houthis in Yemen by rescinding the foreign terrorist organization designation early in the administration. We've seen that sanctions on Iran have not been enforced by the administration. In fact, oil exports from Iran have perhaps tripled. We just saw a couple days ago, you mentioned in the report, the latest news on a plot to kidnap an American-based journalist out of New York. The same day, the administration announced it was allowing Iran to use money that it had locked up in Japan and South Korea to pay its debts. So I think if you're in Tehran, you're looking at the game pieces here. You're also advancing your nuclear program wildly, holding the IAEA hostage in Vienna. No repercussions there from the United States either. So I think they're basically saying, wow, we're no longer in dire straits. We have the money we need to survive. Let's see how much we can get away with until we actually have to agree to something.
All right, though we have to know most of the sanctions are still in place. I just want to go to a quote. Democratic Senator Robert Menendez spoke to reporters after meeting with Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, saying that it appears a deal appears unlikely in the near future because, quote, there is clarity that beyond returning to the JCPOA, there has to be a follow-on agreement, and that seems to be a problem for the Iranians. Meaning, and we should note, Senator Menendez, even though he's a Democrat, he's been quite skeptical about reviving the JCPOA, seems to be saying that it looks like for the Iranians, this notion of a longer, stronger deal that would cover some of their other activities, that appears to be a no-go.
And Ebrahim Raisi, in his first press conference after he was selected president, said very clearly, we will never negotiate a longer, stronger deal. We will never negotiate over our missiles or our regional activity. It's simply off the table. And furthermore, we will never negotiate anything stronger than the JCPOA, all the sunset provisions that we've talked about for years that have already started last October with the arms embargo lifting. So if you're the administration in Washington and your whole idea was you were going to negotiate a longer, stronger deal by going back into the old deal, which many are criticizing on both sides of the aisle as insufficient, why do you now say the outcome, the objective, is simply to go back into that old deal with no hopes of ever negotiating a follow-on deal? And I think, again, I come back to this. At some point, Washington has to reassess its policy. The Biden administration has to reassess. You can't just sit there and let Iran advance its nuclear program, attack U.S. forces throughout the region, break sanctions with its oil exports, get access to money in different countries, and do nothing except say, hey, we want to go back to the old deal.
Right. And just briefly, you mentioned that kidnap plot that was exposed yesterday by the Justice Department. That's just going to make this a harder sell, even within the Democratic Party, for the Biden administration.
I think so. I think it was very tone deaf to send waivers for sanctions to Capitol Hill to allow Iran to use its oil money to pay debts the same afternoon that the Department of Justice announced these indictments about a kidnapping of a U.S. citizen off of U.S. soil. just brazen. But I think it shows that there needs to be a high-level reassessment of policy in the White House. If you leave negotiators to negotiate in Vienna and do not have oversight and have somebody watching the train as it's pulling into the station, you're going to get very bad results for national security.
All right, Richard Goldberg of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, thank you for joining us on The Rundown.